I handed my nephew 90 million and trusted him completely. 8 years later, I got a call from a financial auditor that changed everything. "You need a lawyer. Now," she said. And in that moment, I realized I might lose it all. Hit subscribe if you believe life always finds a way to balance the scales, because this story proves it. I never imagined that the biggest mistake of my life would come from someone I trusted more than anyone else in my family. It all started 8 years ago, the day I decided to hand my nephew, Michael, a sum of money that most people would only dream of handling in a lifetime. $9 million. $9 million. I had worked my entire life building a business from scratch, sacrificing comfort, nights out, even family vacations, just to ensure that my children and relatives would have a financial cushion they could rely on. But for Michael, it wasn't just about giving him a cushion. I believed he had the brains, ambition, and discipline to grow it into something even greater. I believed in him so much that I didn't even think twice before transferring the funds. Michael was always the golden boy of the family. Even as a teenager, he had a way of charming people effortlessly. He was articulate, confident, and had that rare ability to make you feel that anything he touched would turn to gold. I watched him graduate top of his class, land internships at prestigious companies, and handle projects that most adults would have struggled with. But it wasn't just his accomplishments that impressed me. It was the way he carried himself, the way he genuinely seemed to care about family, about doing the right thing. I thought, if anyone could manage this responsibility, it was him. The day I handed over the check, I remember feeling a strange mixture of excitement and relief. Sitting in my home office, I laid out my expectations clearly. I wanted Michael to manage the money wisely, invest it in stable ventures, and ensure it grew steadily over the years. I also asked him to keep me updated regularly, to show me statements, and to be transparent about any decisions he made. He smiled and nodded, that charming grin spreading across his face, and promised he would handle everything perfectly. He even gave me a small, handwritten investment plan that he had drafted himself. I remember feeling proud, thinking, this is the moment I pass the torch. He will make me proud. The first few months went smoothly. Michael sent me reports and summaries of investments, and everything seemed in order. I trusted him completely, often marveling at how responsible and mature he seemed for his age. Family gatherings were filled with compliments about him, and I couldn't stop boasting to my friends about how my nephew was the perfect blend of intelligence, ambition, and integrity. At the time, I had no reason to doubt him. But the trust I placed in him went beyond just money. It was personal. I had always been wary of people taking advantage of me. Over the years, I had seen relatives squabble over inheritances, friends betray each other, and even business partners disappear overnight with funds that weren't theirs to take. Yet with Michael, I felt different. He was family, he was brilliant, and he had a certain moral compass that seemed unshakable. That day, when I handed over $9 million, I felt an immense sense of relief. Finally, I could step back and watch someone younger take control, grow the money, and secure his own future, and perhaps mine indirectly as well. For the first year, everything appeared to be perfect. Michael called occasionally to discuss minor updates, and the reports he sent were professional, filled with charts and projections. I felt an odd sense of pride whenever I looked at those numbers, imagining that one day he might be able to manage even more significant investments on his own. Friends who knew about the arrangement were impressed, some even envious, and I quietly enjoyed the feeling of knowing that I had nurtured and trusted someone who could truly make the money work. But it wasn't just the reports that made me confident. It was Michael himself. He would come over for dinner, talk about his dreams, and explain his future plans in ways that made sense. I felt like I had created not just a financial legacy, but also a mentor-protege bond with someone I considered almost like a son. He had this way of looking at me while explaining his plans, and I always felt that he genuinely wanted to do right by me. That kind of trust is rare in life, and I cherished it. I even found myself occasionally daydreaming about what he could achieve with even more resources, imagining the investments he could make, the companies he could support, and the opportunities he could create. As the second and third years passed, the pattern continued. Reports arrived on time, investments seemed to be growing steadily, and Michael's demeanor never gave me reason to doubt him. I began to relax completely, feeling almost carefree about the entire arrangement. The money was technically still mine, but the way I thought about it had shifted. I was no longer micromanaging, no longer anxious about every decision. Instead, I trusted Michael entirely. I didn't ask for unnecessary details. I didn't check accounts obsessively. I simply believed in him. During family events, Michael would talk about potential new ventures, occasionally asking for my input, but mostly sharing plans about how he intended to expand the portfolio. He spoke of conservative growth strategies, diversifying into real estate, and even exploring technology startups. At the time, it all sounded perfectly reasonable. I was impressed with how strategic he seemed, how forward-thinking, how careful yet ambitious. I even remember one evening, sitting on my porch with a glass of wine, feeling a deep sense of pride and thinking, this is exactly how family should work. We trust each other. We grow together. And yet, as perfect as everything seemed, there were tiny moments that I now wish I had paid more attention to. Small delays in communication, vague answers about certain transactions, occasional excuses for why a report was late. Nothing alarming at the time, just minor inconsistencies that I chalked up to his busy schedule. After all, he was building his own career, handling multiple investments, and learning how to manage this significant sum. I told myself repeatedly that these were just growing pains, signs that he was taking on more than he could handle. I remember one particular night, about 2 years in, when Michael stayed over after a family dinner. He was unusually animated, talking about a once in a lifetime opportunity. He had discovered something that required fast action. He reassured me repeatedly that it was safe and that he would handle all the logistics. I felt a familiar surge of confidence in him and told him to go ahead. I didn't ask questions. I didn't doubt him. That was the moment I realized just how much trust I had placed in him. Blind trust. By the end of the 4th year, my life had become noticeably easier in terms of stress about finances. I no longer worried about investments, market volatility, or business decisions. Michael had effectively taken over a significant portion of my financial responsibilities, and it felt liberating. But little did I know that the foundation of that trust, built over decades of family loyalty and personal pride, was about to be shaken to its core. Every interaction, every report, every conversation had built a narrative in my mind that Michael was responsible, intelligent, and utterly trustworthy. But as with many stories of blind trust, appearances can be deceiving. I didn't know it at the time, but beneath the charm, confidence, and carefully crafted reports, the first seeds of trouble were already taking root. It would take nearly 4 more years before I would see the cracks, before the carefully constructed illusion would start to crumble. And by then, the consequences would be enormous. For now, though, in that moment 8 years ago, I felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction and relief. I had entrusted the money to family, I had done my duty, and I felt certain that it was in the best hands possible. Little did I know, the very person I had chosen to rely on could also become the architect of my deepest financial nightmare. For the first few years after handing Michael the 900 million, life felt almost too easy. I had built this financial safety net painstakingly, and now, it seemed, the weight of managing it had been lifted entirely from my shoulders. I could focus on my hobbies, my friends, even travel occasionally without the gnawing anxiety of checking every investment or every statement. Michael had always been the perfect protégé, always presenting himself as competent, charming, and responsible. Yet as the years went by, small, almost imperceptible cracks began to appear. Tiny inconsistencies that I dismissed at the time as minor oversights or the natural chaos of life. It started with phone calls that he missed. At first, they were easy to excuse. He was busy at work, traveling for business, or meeting with potential investors. He would send a brief text afterward, apologizing for not answering, promising to call back soon. I didn't think much of it, trusting that he was simply juggling responsibilities. But over time, these missed calls became more frequent. There were days when I would call, and the phone would ring endlessly, only for Michael to text later, vaguely explaining that he had been caught up with urgent matters. I remember feeling a flicker of unease the first time. I noticed this pattern, but I pushed it aside. He was family. I believed in him. Reports, too, began to change subtly. For the first few years, they had been detailed, professional, filled with charts, projections, and clear summaries of investments. But gradually, the reports became shorter, less precise, often filled with generalities rather than specifics. A line here or thereabout, all investments performing well, replaced the usual detailed breakdowns. When I asked questions, Michael would reassure me with a casual smile and a vague explanation, insisting that everything was fine. I wanted to trust him, and so I did. Each time a warning bell rang, I silenced it with the comforting thought that he knew what he was doing. Friends and family began to notice changes as well. Some would ask how Michael was handling the funds, or whether I was reviewing statements regularly. I would brush off their concerns with a wave of my hand, insisting that he was trustworthy and capable. But deep down, a nagging worry had started to grow in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly off, that the picture Michael painted wasn't quite as perfect as it seemed. Yet every time I tried to dwell on it, I reminded myself that I had seen his intelligence and diligence firsthand. How could someone so skilled, so charming, possibly betray me? Then came the first serious hint that things might not be entirely as they seemed. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I received a bank statement in the mail. Normally, Michael would send me summaries, but this one had come directly to me, a courtesy of my own bank. I glanced through the pages quickly, noticing some unusually large withdrawals that I didn't recall authorizing. A sinking feeling spread through me. I picked up the phone and called Michael immediately. He answered with his usual warmth, laughter even, and explained that the withdrawals were for legitimate investments, high-yield ventures that were just taking a bit longer to show returns. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust him. And I did, convincing myself that there was a reasonable explanation. But the doubt lingered. After that incident, I began noticing other oddities. Conversations with Michael would sometimes feel rehearsed, overly confident, almost defensive when I asked specific questions about certain transactions. The easy charm that once reassured me now felt like a mask, a performance intended to keep me from digging too deeply. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about the funds, trying to reconcile the numbers I had seen with the updates Michael provided. Each time, I rationalized, telling myself that I had no real evidence of wrongdoing, only minor inconsistencies that could easily have legitimate explanations. As the years stretched on, Michael became increasingly busy, or at least that was the story he told me. He was attending conferences, meeting potential investors, and exploring business opportunities across the country. He sent occasional photos of fancy office buildings, high-rise meetings, and bustling trading floors. At first, these images impressed me. I felt a mix of pride and relief, thinking that the money was not only safe, but actively growing under his careful guidance. But slowly, a sense of distance began to grow between us. He seemed less available, less communicative, and more guarded. Whenever I pressed him for details, he would smile and say, "Everything is fine, Uncle. You worry too much." I began to notice another troubling pattern. Certain acquaintances of Michael started to appear in conversations and emails. I didn't recognize many of them, and some of them had names that sounded vaguely suspicious. Investors, consultants, business partners whose credentials I couldn't verify. Each time I asked Michael about them, he would brush it off with charm, insisting they were reputable contacts helping to grow the investments. I tried to trust him, but the unease was growing, like a persistent itch I couldn't scratch. It was during the 5th year that the first serious confrontation occurred, though it didn't feel like one at the time. Michael had sent an update that seemed off, a summary that didn't match the expected returns, with cryptic notes and unclear references. I called him immediately, seeking clarity. His voice was smooth, almost too smooth, as he explained the discrepancies away as short-term fluctuations in the market. He assured me that everything would balance out in the long run, that the overall trajectory of the investments was positive. I remember feeling a pang of doubt, but still clinging to the belief that he was right. After all, he had always been intelligent and careful, hadn't he? Then came the moment that truly began to shake me. A distant cousin, someone I trusted, casually mentioned hearing rumors that Michael had been living far beyond his apparent means. Luxury cars, high-end apartments, expensive trips. At first, I dismissed it. People love to gossip, and I didn't want to think the worst of my nephew, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. I found myself noticing small signs, Instagram posts he tagged, mentions of exclusive events he attended, and the sudden appearance of luxury items in photos he sent me. Each one chipped away at the foundation of trust I had so carefully built. I began to confront myself with difficult questions. Could Michael really afford these things legitimately through the investments he managed? Were there hidden fees, unreported profits, or mismanaged funds? I tried to gather my courage to ask directly, but every time I did, I felt a mixture of guilt and fear. Guilt for doubting family, fear of what the truth might be. Each time I broached the subject, he would charm his way out of the conversation, reassure me with smiles, and promise that everything was fine. I wanted to believe him, desperately, because the alternative was terrifying. By the 7th year, the pattern of unease had settled into a constant background hum. I no longer felt completely comfortable, yet I still allowed myself to be convinced by Michael's reassurances. The reports continued, though they were less detailed. The calls became shorter and less frequent. The explanations grew vague. Still, I held on to the hope that he was managing the money responsibly, that these minor inconsistencies were just part of the natural complexity of handling such a large sum. And yet, deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, a heavy knot that refused to loosen. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about trust, about the sense of betrayal that seemed to lurk just beyond the surface. I had given him not just funds, but faith, confidence, and my belief in his integrity, and somewhere along the way, that faith had begun to feel fragile, like a delicate glass teetering on the edge of a table. It was in that uneasy state of mind, hovering between trust and suspicion, that I received the first tip that would change everything. A friend who worked in finance mentioned a situation similar to mine. Someone had entrusted a large sum to a relative, and years later, it had been mishandled. She warned me to check my accounts thoroughly and consider hiring an auditor if anything seemed off. At the time, I nodded politely, promising to look into it. But inside, I felt a growing dread, a realization that perhaps my trust in Michael had been too absolute, too blind. Little did I know, that small suggestion would set in motion a chain of events that would upend everything I believed about family, loyalty, and money. The comfort and confidence I had felt for so many years were about to be replaced with doubt, anxiety, and a creeping fear that I had handed the keys of my fortune to someone who might not have my best interests at heart. And that fear, at first subtle and almost ignorable, was only the beginning. It all came crashing down one late afternoon, when I finally decided that I couldn't ignore my gut any longer. After years of feeling uneasy and brushing aside my suspicions, I reached a breaking point. The whispers, the missed calls, the vague reports, they had piled up into a mountain of doubt that I could no longer pretend wasn't there. I called a financial auditor, someone reputable, experienced, and completely independent, and scheduled an appointment to go through every single transaction from the past 8 years. My hands shook as I made the call, a knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. Deep down, I feared what I might find, but I also knew that ignoring it would be far worse. The day the auditor arrived, I felt like I was preparing for a storm I couldn't control. She was professional, composed, and thorough. I handed over the documents Michael had sent me over the years, along with the statements I had received directly from the bank. I watched nervously as she began to sift through them, her eyes scanning line after line, her expression neutral but intense. For hours, I sat silently, gripping a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, listening to the occasional sound of pages shuffling and the soft click of her pen. Every so often, she would mutter something under her breath, numbers, percentages, unfamiliar account names. My stomach churned with anticipation and fear, and then she looked up at me with a seriousness I had never seen before. "Mr. Thompson," she said, using my last name formally, as though the gravity of the situation demanded it. "You need a lawyer." "Now?" Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. I felt my vision blur, my heart pound, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I don't understand," I stammered, my voice barely audible. She didn't need to explain further. The look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. As she laid out the findings, the nightmare unfolded in slow motion. Michael had been mismanaging the funds in ways I could never have imagined. Large sums were unaccounted for. Investments had been made without my knowledge, and some transactions were downright suspicious. There were withdrawals labeled as consulting fees that seemed to vanish into thin air, and money that had supposedly been invested in safe ventures had been redirected into high-risk startups, some of which had already collapsed. My mind raced, trying to comprehend how this could have happened. Every reassurance, every smile, every promise Michael had made over the years now felt like a carefully orchestrated lie. The auditor went through each irregularity meticulously. She explained how some funds had been siphoned off into personal accounts, how certain investments were tied to companies Michael had created himself, and how much of the money might be unrecoverable. I felt my chest tighten, my body trembling as the reality sank in. I had trusted him completely, and in return, he had hidden the truth, perhaps hoping I would never notice. 8 years of faith, of loyalty, of blind trust. It felt as though it had been ripped from me in a single, devastating moment. I tried to recall the years of missed calls, the vague reports, the luxury vacations he had shown off so casually. Each detail now seemed like a glaring warning I had chosen to ignore. The pride I had once felt in my nephew, the sense of accomplishment at passing the money to someone I believed was capable and honest, was replaced by a heavy, bitter weight of betrayal. The thought that someone so close to me, someone I had considered family, could deceive me so thoroughly was almost unbearable. What can I do? I asked the auditor, my voice breaking. She sighed, understanding the mix of anger, grief, and fear in my tone. You need to act quickly, she said. This isn't just about reclaiming money. There may be legal implications, tax issues, and potential fraud charges. If you wait, he could further complicate matters, hide assets, or even liquidate remaining funds. You need a lawyer, and you need one who specializes in financial disputes and family trusts. I left her office feeling numb, a storm of emotions raging inside me. I tried to contact Michael immediately, calling and texting repeatedly, but there was no response. The very person I had relied on for nearly a decade was suddenly unreachable. I imagined him somewhere, perhaps in a luxury apartment, perhaps flaunting wealth that wasn't rightfully his, completely unaware, or perhaps entirely aware of the devastation he had caused me. Every memory of our time together, every promise he had made, now felt like part of an elaborate act. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls, legal consultations, and sleepless nights. I met with attorneys who explained the complexity of my situation, recovering mismanaged funds from a family member, dealing with potentially falsified documents, and navigating the labyrinth of tax and investment laws. Each explanation added to my anxiety. I realized this was bigger than I had imagined. This wasn't just a case of negligence. It was a betrayal with deep legal ramifications, and I had to prepare for a battle I never wanted to fight. Amid the chaos, I found myself reflecting on Michael's behavior over the years. The missed calls, the vague reports, the sudden display of wealth. It all fit into a pattern I had ignored, rationalized, and excused. How could I have been so blind? How could I have trusted him so completely? These questions haunted me, gnawing at my mind. And yet, the legal reality left no room for contemplation or forgiveness. I had to act. I had to protect what was left of my wealth, and I had to hold Michael accountable. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about principle, justice, and the integrity of family trust. If someone could deceive me so thoroughly, what message did that send to others? What precedent did it set? I realized that my decision to act wasn't merely personal. It was necessary to prevent further harm, both financially and emotionally, to myself and possibly to others who trusted Michael. The auditor handed me a detailed report, listing every discrepancy, every suspicious transaction, and every potential violation. I studied it obsessively, my mind racing through scenarios of confrontation, negotiation, and litigation. The complexity was overwhelming, but beneath it all was a single, piercing truth: Michael had betrayed me in ways I had never imagined. My confidence, my faith, and my trust had been weaponized against me, and the enormity of that realization left me shaken to my core. For the first time, I saw the full picture. 8 years of careful planning, of promises, of assurances, had been undermined by deceit. The reports, the photos of luxury lifestyles, the casual charm, they were all part of a carefully constructed facade. And now, faced with the stark reality, I felt an urgent, almost desperate need to reclaim control before the situation worsened. I knew that legal intervention was not optional. It was essential. In that moment, I also understood something else. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was deeply personal. Michael had manipulated the very foundation of our relationship, taking advantage of the love, trust, and pride I had in him. Every phone call I had ignored, every casual reassurance I had accepted, every prideful moment I had enjoyed thinking he was doing well, all of it had been part of the illusion. And now, I had to dismantle that illusion, piece by piece, to uncover the truth and protect what remained. The next steps were clear, though daunting. I needed to secure a lawyer, gather all evidence, and prepare for the confrontation that would inevitably come. I needed to protect my finances, my family, and perhaps my own sense of self-worth. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating, but it also sparked a determination I hadn't realized I possessed. Michael's betrayal was monumental, but I refused to let it define the rest of my life. I would fight, and I would do everything in my power to reclaim what was rightfully mine. And so, with the auditor's report clutched tightly in my hands and a heavy heart, I took the first step toward confronting the unimaginable reality. The nephew I had trusted completely had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and now the battle to recover not just my money, but my faith in family was about to begin. The moment I hired a lawyer, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief, because I finally had professional guidance. Dread, because the reality of confronting Michael and the years of betrayal suddenly hit me with full force. The attorney I consulted was experienced in financial disputes involving family members, and she wasted no time explaining the stakes. Recovering mismanaged funds, she said, was complicated under normal circumstances, but when the person involved was a close relative, it added layers of emotional and legal complexity. She warned me that Michael might resist, manipulate, or even try to hide assets. I nodded grimly, knowing that this would not be an easy fight. The first step was sending a formal notice to Michael, demanding a detailed accounting of all transactions and investments over the past 8 years. I remember feeling my heart pound as I drafted the letter with my lawyer. Each word carried weight, each sentence a firm demand for truth. When Michael received it, I expected resistance, but I didn't expect the arrogance. He called me the same evening, his voice calm, almost amused. "Why all the drama, Uncle?" he asked lightly. "Everything is fine. You're worrying over nothing." The casualness in his tone made my blood boil. He was mocking me, testing my patience, perhaps trying to see how far he could push before I snapped. The lawyer advised me not to respond emotionally, but to stay methodical. Every interaction had to be documented, every call recorded, every promise noted. It felt unnatural at first, reducing family interactions to evidence gathering, but I knew it was necessary. Michael had weaponized our relationship against me. Now, I had to treat it as a legal battle rather than a family dispute. As days turned into weeks, the tension escalated. Michael delayed sending documentation, claiming technical issues, or consultants being unavailable. Each excuse rang hollow, and I grew increasingly frustrated. I began to notice the subtle psychological games he played. Texts that seemed innocent, but were loaded with guilt, tripping undertones. Calls that were brief and patronizing, attempts to make me question my own judgment. It was as if he were enjoying the power imbalance he had created, taking satisfaction in seeing me anxious, doubtful, and uncertain. Family gatherings became unbearable. Relatives who had once admired Michael began to pick sides. Some expressed sympathy for me, quietly asking if I had been aware of the situation sooner. Others, dazzled by Michael's charisma and charm, subtly hinted that perhaps I was overreacting. It was isolating. I realized that the betrayal wasn't just financial. It was social and emotional. Michael had manipulated perceptions, ensuring that even within our family, he could maintain an image of innocence while undermining me behind the scenes. One evening, after a particularly tense family dinner, I sat alone in my study, reviewing the partial documents Michael had finally provided. There were discrepancies everywhere. Accounts that didn't match, funds that seemed to have vanished, investments that were questionable at best. I felt a surge of anger so strong it left me shaking. How could someone I had trusted completely, someone I had nurtured and believed in, betray me so thoroughly? The thought of confrontation made my hands tremble, yet it also steeled my resolve. I couldn't allow this to continue. The first major breakthrough came when my lawyer uncovered a series of hidden accounts and transfers that Michael had neglected to disclose. Some of the money had been funneled into shell companies. Some had been withdrawn under the guise of consulting fees. Others had been invested in risky ventures without my consent. The scale of mismanagement was staggering. It was no longer a matter of minor negligence. This was deliberate manipulation and concealment. I felt a mix of disbelief and fury. The same person I had once praised for integrity and ambition had been orchestrating a sophisticated scheme to divert the funds for personal gain. Armed with this new information, we escalated the matter legally. The lawsuit was filed, and Michael was formally served. The tension that followed was palpable. Suddenly, every interaction with him, every family encounter, was charged with an electric mix of anger, fear, and anticipation. Michael didn't crumble as I had expected. Instead, he responded with a mix of charm and defiance, attempting to negotiate in ways that were manipulative and cunning. He tried to downplay the severity, suggesting compromises that seemed reasonable on the surface, but were clearly designed to protect him and minimize his exposure. Court dates were scheduled, and the legal battle became a relentless cycle of hearings, filings, and negotiations. Each session brought new revelations, emails showing attempts to hide investments, statements proving lavish spending, and even testimony from associates who had been complicit or aware of irregularities. The depth of the betrayal became painfully clear. Every step forward in court was emotionally draining, yet each victory, no matter how small, reinforced my determination to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Family dynamics continued to strain under the weight of the conflict. Some relatives, once neutral or supportive, began to fear repercussions or embarrassment and avoided involvement altogether. Others, horrified by Michael's actions, offered quiet support, reminding me that I wasn't alone in my fight. I realized that trust, once broken, doesn't just affect finances. It reshapes relationships, turning long-held bonds into complicated webs of suspicion, loyalty, and resentment. There were moments of intense frustration, too. Michael's legal team attempted to delay proceedings, citing technicalities, procedural errors, or minor ambiguities in the original agreements. Each delay was a psychological tactic, a way to test my patience and see if I would give up. But I refused. Every phone call, every email, every courtroom appearance was an opportunity to assert control, to reclaim not just the money, but my dignity and authority. The courtroom itself became a theater of tension and revelation. I remember sitting in the gallery, heart pounding, as lawyers presented evidence of lavish spending, falsified documents, and hidden transfers. Michael's face remained calm, almost smug, but I could see cracks in the facade, small shifts in expression, subtle signs of unease whenever a particularly damning document was presented. Each revelation brought me a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction, because the truth was finally coming to light. Sorrow, because it confirmed just how deeply he had betrayed me. As the legal process unfolded, unexpected twists emerged. Some of Michael's attempts to obscure his actions had failed in ways I hadn't anticipated. Bank records, digital trails, and even casual admissions to acquaintances provided the evidence needed to solidify the case. Meanwhile, his charm and manipulative skills, which had worked so effectively in the past, began to falter under the scrutiny of professional investigation. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope that justice might prevail. Even with this progress, the emotional toll was immense. I oscillated between anger, sadness, and cautious optimism. Trust once shattered cannot be easily repaired. The family I had relied upon, the nephew I had idolized, and the years of faith and hope, all of it had been weaponized against me. But amid the pain, I realized an important truth. The only way to move forward was to confront the situation directly, methodically, and relentlessly. Each legal victory, each discovery of hidden accounts or mismanaged funds, was a step toward reclaiming control and restoring a sense of justice. The months of litigation culminated in a critical negotiation session. Michael's team, realizing that the evidence against him was overwhelming, attempted to broker a settlement that would preserve some of his gains while giving me a partial recovery. It was tense, emotionally charged, and at times infuriating. I could see the desperation behind his composed exterior, the fear that he might finally lose control of the situation. After hours of discussion, review, and deliberation, we reached a preliminary agreement. One that promised a significant portion of the funds would be returned, though not without careful monitoring and strict legal conditions. Leaving the courthouse that day, I felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and lingering unease. The legal battle was far from over, but for the first time in years, I felt that the scales were tipping in my favor. I had confronted the betrayal head-on, taken decisive action, and regained a measure of control over a situation that had once seemed hopeless. Yet the emotional scars remained. The realization that someone I had trusted completely could deceive me so thoroughly was a wound that no amount of money could heal. In the end, the legal battle taught me not just about money, but about vigilance, discernment, and the limits of trust. Family ties, once assumed to be unbreakable, could be tested in ways I had never imagined. The path to justice was long, painful, and fraught with emotional challenges, but it was necessary. Michael had betrayed me in the worst possible way, but I refused to let that betrayal define the rest of my life. I had fought, I had endured, and I had reclaimed what was mine, not just financially, but in terms of dignity and principle. And as I reflected on the journey, I realized that the true cost of betrayal was not just the money. It was the trust, the innocence, and the comfort I had once felt. That was something that could never be fully recovered. But at least, through action, I had taken the first steps toward healing and closure. After months of relentless legal proceedings, tense negotiations, and emotional turmoil, the day of resolution finally arrived. I remember waking up that morning with a knot in my stomach, a mix of anxiety and cautious hope. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about closure, about reclaiming some sense of trust in myself and in my ability to protect what mattered. For nearly 8 years, I had lived in a mixture of pride, doubt, and unease, believing in my nephew with a blind faith that had almost cost me everything. Now the long-awaited conclusion loomed, and I knew that no matter what happened, life after this day would never be the same. The settlement was structured carefully. Through the efforts of my lawyer, and in light of overwhelming evidence of mismanagement, Michael agreed to return a significant portion of the funds. Not everything could be recovered. Some money had been spent or lost through risky ventures, but enough remained that the financial foundation I had worked so hard to build could be restored. I felt a strange combination of relief and sorrow as I read through the final documents. Relief, because justice had, in a sense, prevailed. Sorrow, because the betrayal ran deeper than mere dollars. It was the loss of trust, the shattering of familial bonds, and the painful realization that someone I had loved and believed in could deceive me so completely. In the days following the settlement, life felt both lighter and emptier. I no longer had to worry about hidden accounts, suspicious investments, or late-night calls from financial auditors. Yet the emotional scar remained. Every time I thought about Michael, I felt a pang of disappointment, not just in him, but in the way blind trust had clouded my judgment. I had spent years believing in the integrity of family, and while I still cherished that principle, I had learned that trust could be weaponized, manipulated, and shattered in the blink of an eye. It was a lesson I would carry for the rest of my life. Family dynamics remained complicated. Some relatives continued to support me quietly, acknowledging the pain I had endured and respecting the steps I had taken to recover the money. Others, still dazzled by Michael's charm or unwilling to confront the reality of his actions, maintained a wary distance. I realized that betrayal doesn't exist in isolation. It ripples outward, affecting relationships, perceptions, and the subtle social fabric of family life. The settlement had resolved the financial aspect, but the emotional fallout lingered, reminding me that trust, once broken, cannot be fully restored. I spent long hours reflecting on the entire journey. I thought about the day I handed Michael the $9 million, the pride I felt in his abilities, and the confidence I had in his integrity. I remembered the early years of smooth reports, charming phone calls, and the sense of security that had lulled me into complacency. And then I thought about the signs I had ignored. The vague reports, missed calls, subtle hints of extravagance, and fleeting moments of doubt. Hindsight revealed a trail of red flags I had chosen to overlook, blinded by love and faith. It was a painful realization, but an essential one. I understood that vigilance and discernment were not acts of cynicism. They were acts of self-preservation. The experience also forced me to examine my own role in what had happened. I had trusted blindly, yes, but I had also allowed pride and optimism to cloud my judgment. I had believed in the best version of my nephew, without questioning the reality of his actions. It was a hard lesson in the balance between faith in others and accountability, between emotional attachment and practical oversight. I realized that responsibility, especially when it involves large sums of money and family dynamics, requires both heart and vigilance. One without the other can lead to catastrophe. Despite the pain, there were moments of unexpected clarity and even growth. I found that reclaiming control over the situation, even partially, restored a sense of empowerment that I had thought lost. The money that was returned allowed me to secure investments more wisely, set stricter protocols for oversight, and ensure that my financial legacy would endure. More importantly, it gave me the emotional space to rebuild a sense of personal security and confidence. I was no longer at the mercy of someone else's deceit. I had faced the betrayal, taken action, and regained some measure of control over my life. Over time, I also began to process the emotional complexity of my relationship with Michael. It was tempting to reduce everything to anger, resentment, and bitterness, but I recognized that he was a reflection of choices and flaws, not the entirety of my experience with family or trust. I allowed myself to grieve the loss of faith in him, while also acknowledging that life often presents difficult lessons through the actions of those we love. In a strange way, the betrayal forced me to grow, to reassess my priorities, and to develop a sharper sense of discernment in both personal and financial matters. I also considered the broader implications for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. Family bonds, while precious, are not infallible guarantees of integrity. Wealth and trust can be exploited, sometimes by the people we least expect. I realized that protecting oneself doesn't mean abandoning love or suspicion, but rather maintaining clear boundaries, thorough oversight, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It was a painful lesson, but one that ultimately strengthened my resolve and sense of responsibility. Looking back, I understand now that the journey, as painful as it was necessary. It forced me to confront betrayal, injustice, and the fragility of trust. It also revealed my own resilience, determination, and capacity to navigate complex emotional and financial challenges. While Michael's actions caused deep hurt, they also provided a harsh, unforgettable lesson about the intersection of family, loyalty, and accountability. I emerged from the experience wiser, more cautious, but also more empowered. In the final weeks after the settlement, I began to rebuild both financially and emotionally. I implemented rigorous oversight for my investments, sought guidance from multiple advisors, and developed a network of checks and balances to prevent a similar situation in the future. More importantly, I allowed myself to process the emotional impact fully, seeking closure rather than lingering resentment. I realized that holding on to anger would serve only to prolong the pain, whereas taking control of my life and finances allowed me to reclaim a sense of peace. Though the scars remain, I now view the experience as a turning point. I learned that trust, while invaluable, must be paired with discernment. Loyalty, while admirable, must coexist with accountability, and love, while unconditional in some senses, does not preclude the need for vigilance when it comes to matters of wealth and personal responsibility. Michael's betrayal was profound, but my response, decisive, patient, and informed, ultimately defined the outcome. The final reflection I carry with me is this: betrayal, though painful, can reveal strength we didn't know we possessed. It can teach us hard truths about human nature, about family, and about ourselves. And while money can be recovered, the lessons learned from such an experience are priceless. I may never fully forgive what happened, but I have reclaimed my life, my confidence, and my sense of control. And in the end, that is worth more than any sum of money. As I look forward, I do so with a blend of caution and optimism. I have rebuilt the financial stability I once feared lost. I have reasserted boundaries with family, and I have cultivated a renewed awareness of the importance of vigilance. The past 8 years, with all their triumphs, fears, and heartbreaks, have left an indelible mark, but they have also left me stronger, wiser, and better prepared for the future. And though the shadow of betrayal will always linger, I now stand firmly in the light of regained control, resilience, and clarity.